Very little in history compares to the French Revolution. The collapse of what was the most powerful kingdom in Europe and the birth of a radical republican regime hell-bent on spreading liberalism and republican rule scared monarchs all over the continent, from Lisbon to St. Petersburg. Popular rule, at least at first, secular government, the rise of nationalism, and the ideal that the state should represent the people and citizenry of the nation were all embodied by this revolution. While the revolution would be quote-unquote defeated, the Bourbon monarchy would fall for the final time in 1830, France's standing as the leading power of continental Europe would be destroyed, and liberalism and nationalism would ultimately doom European colonial adventures throughout the 20th century, with many of them calling the American and French revolutions as inspiration and justification. This, of course, begs the question, what if it didn't, though? Now, unfortunately for our purposes, this is very hard to make happen. Supporting American independence made the absolutist Louis XVI look extraordinarily hypocritical since he blew the entire treasury on a tax revolt turned revolution. Add in that France was already broke beforehand, something about losing the biggest war in history and vast majority of their overseas empire and all the exploitation that went into it, I think. I don't know. Louis XV kinda sucks at his job too. Now, Louis XVI did try to fix this. He spent numerous years working to levy new taxes on the nobility, but none of it worked, and mostly made things worse. As a result, when bread and food prices rose, something was bound to give. Add in a rigged Estates General and a tennis court oath, and I don't think you can really avoid the French Revolution without mucking around with the American War of Independence. But we can keep it from going crazy, at least relatively. See, increased radicalism in the revolutionaries led to the king effectively being kidnapped from his traditional palace in Versailles and brought to Paris. However, as a result of this, he felt like a prisoner, alienating him from the constitutional government, and eventually he attempted to flee for Austria. Austria and Prussia had been amassing soldiers for a war to restore Louis to power and crush the revolution, further radicalizing the people. So when Louis ran off to a country that the French people did not like, who was amassing armies on their border, it looked bad. It was absolutely terrible for his PR and led to charges of treason and his eventual execution. This is what brought Republicanism from the fringes and the coffee houses to the Legislative Assembly. So there's our point of divergence. Louis isn't kidnapped and dragged back to Paris, which prevents him from fearing for his life, so he just doesn't take the gamble. He gets to keep his funny hat and his head. Now, realistically, the monarchy was suspended before being abolished, and they killed him even after that, so it's entirely plausible they get him on some other trumped-up charge, but for the sake of the scenario, he lives. What now? Well, from here it gets kind of tricky. The Legislative Assembly was deeply unstable and replaced itself within a year, but I think it could have stabilized without the unrest that the flight of Varnes caused. Considering that it was only replaced by the National Convention after an insurrection against the Assembly and the king that took place after the flight, the 1791 elections probably aren't changed by this. And if anything, the Jacobins lose seats. But partisanship was seen as a divider, and most of the assembled tried to avoid active political parties. They were called Le Plan for a reason. So we have a somewhat more stable France, albeit still with economic woes and political division running high. Now let's talk war, which is always good for a young and fragile constitutional system. The revolutionary government hated the Ancien regime's alliance with Austria and wanted to export the revolution. Hell, Louis XVI supported them doing so. Now, to be fair, that could have been coerced, but still. Now, the Legislative Assembly was elected to 2-year terms, and I don't see anything about suspending that in wartime. As a result, if the first coalition goes how it did in real life, and I don't see why it wouldn't, I would expect the Jacobins to control government from 1793 onward. However, I don't think they'd be able to remove Louis from power or kill him, so this would probably avoid involvement by the Dutch and Spanish. Britain, they might declare war on themselves, since that's what they did in real life, but I'm not sure. Technically, the Holy Roman Empire might not be fully dragged in, but fighting will absolutely happen in southern Germany, and the left bank of the Rhine is probably brought into France through that. Thus, we still have a period of struggle between the French and the conservative powers of Europe. However, there are a few changes. Firstly, Britain is a lot less ideological in their conflict, since the French government isn't trying to end monarchy and take over Europe. They're just trying to take over Europe, and Britain is used to France doing that. Secondly, France is in a position to actually make genuine allies, since they didn't kill Louis. Firstly, I could see the Netherlands being roped into it, since they had their own protests very similar to the French Revolution, and were struggling under a perceived protectorate status from Britain and Prussia, meaning they could still easily revolt and invite France in. This would mean that the Batavian Republic would still exist, and might possibly be seen as a client state, but if this happens between wars, I'm not so sure. And Britain probably can't snipe most of their empire. Or maybe they do. Secondly, Spain and Prussia have political reasons to hitch a ride to France, even if they're not the biggest fans of this constitution and liberalism and peasants are people stuff that the French keep talking about. The Spanish rivalry with Britain and Portugal is pretty well known, as are France's repeated attempts to bribe Prussia with Hanover. Prussia probably isn't actually involved, it's just a possibility. War would probably kick back up around 1798 to 1800 like it did in our world. But here's the kicker. This is when Napoleon actually came to power, usurping the Directory and establishing his consulate. Which can't happen here since the assembly is stabilized and the monarchy is fine. So what's he gonna do? Well, frankly, he's probably unable to get too political, but he might have been able to take over a French client state in Italy, being that he set it up in the first place in our world, and he was Corsican. Now, from here, I think that without Napoleon's skill as an overarching commander and strategist, France will come out nominally victorious, but I don't think they'll be able to keep everything. They might lose Italy and the Batavians, even if they keep the Rhine, which, to be fair, is still a success. From here, what happens? Well, we're going to have to leave France for a bit. The Spanish Empire is probably affected just as much as France was, since it avoids some of the chaos it suffered in real life. However, I think that Ferdinand would eventually try to stage a coup against his father, Charles IV, potentially leading to a civil war around 1808. In addition to economic and political instability, this would very likely result in the disintegration of the Spanish Empire as colonies are forced to pick a king, which could easily spiral into questions of independence and liberalism. In addition, I could see Florida and maybe even Cuba being hit with American filibusters, private armies taking over the colonies, like we saw in Texas, and tried in Canada more than a few times. The US has a long interest in just about everything Spain had north of Mexico, but couldn't act on it without angering the great power or potentially Britain. Now, if Spain's in a civil war, though... But you know what's not being decided by civil war? The fact that if you like this video so far, you should consider subscribing for a new alternate history video every week. Another country worth considering is Haiti. Haiti was born from the first truly successful slave revolt in history and ended white rule over the black slave majority. However, it didn't start as an independence revolt, as most of the revolutionaries believed that the government had abolished slavery and they were being denied this. So when France does abolish slavery, which it would, Haiti will go down a similar path to ours, at least to start. However, I think that with more stability and a lack of fighting at home, France would attempt to reign in the colony sooner, which could go either way, with revolutions against French control and de facto independence, or the territory being incorporated into France properly. Most of the population considered themselves Frenchmen, so I lean toward the latter, at least for a while. Germany will also be highly affected from 1800 onward. Prussia doesn't have the Rhine in this world, meaning it is still the least of the great powers and in no position to unify Germany. Frankly, German nationalism will just be weaker than in our world without the Confederation of the Rhine and the decades of French occupation. The Austrian status quo of the Holy Roman Empire would last for at least a couple more decades, not really being challenged until something like the Revolution of 1848, and even then, there wouldn't be an obvious alternative. In contrast, I actually think that Italy could probably come out pretty similar to our world. Napoleon still took over Italy, installing himself as the president of the Cisalpine Republic, but then that French client state was dissolved. However, Napoleon himself could well escape or defect to the coalition and become an Italian nationalist figure instead of a French one. This could well mean that Italian nationalism is still flared up, and with Austrian and French meddling well into the 19th century, that will frustrate a lot of people, and the Kingdom of Sardinia. While the details of unification will be very different without, say, Napoleon III, I do think that Italy will still be affected enough that it will grow to challenge Austria. By the 1820s, I think that France will be a very different place. Firstly, it will have naturally moderated after decades of constitutional rule. I do also think it would have amended that 2-year term for the assembly just for the sake of governance. In addition, Louis XVI might wind up a reasonably successful constitutional monarch. He attempted to work with the Jacobin parties pretty often and had cabinets staffed with the Girondins, who were actually anti-monarchy, just conservative relatives to the Jacobins. Thus, I think that over the 19th century, while France will continue to liberalize, the power of the king will remain tangible for a few decades. Louis XVII, having grown up under this constitutional system, might be less proactive, but it's not like George III or Kaiser Wilhelm never had problems with their legislatures. Without a 20-year death struggle exhausting France and leaving Britain unmatched, I think they'd come to blows a lot more often during the 19th century, especially over colonial disputes. Especially since France has the means to aid anti-British agents in India like Louis XVI wanted to, and he even claimed Western Australia and got up to stuff in Indochina. Basically, colonizer who saw everything taken wanted to colonize. However, other than some weird World War I sort of death battle, there's no real way to predict anything at this point. We've created a scenario where everything's too divergent to really guess alliances or anything at this point, so I think I have to end it. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing for more and leave any thoughts down in the comments below.